to the thesis that it is only from the standpoint of a very different tradition, one whose beliefs and presuppositions were articulated in their classical form by Aristotle, that we can understand both the genesis and the predicament of moral modernity. It is important to note that I am not claiming that Aristotelian moral theory is able to exhibit its rational superiority in terms that would be acceptable to the protagonists of the dominant post-Enlightenment moral philosophies, so that in theoretical contests in the arenas of modernity, Aristotelians might be able to defeat Kantians, utilitarians, and contractarians. Not only is this evidently not so, but in those same areas, Aristotelianism is bound to appear, and does appear, as just one more type of moral theory, one whose protagonists have as much and as little hope of defeating their rivals as do utilitarians, Kantians, or contractarians. What then was I, and am I, claiming? That from the standpoint of an ongoing way of life, informed by and expressed through Aristotelian concepts, it is possible to understand what the predicament of moral modernity is, and why the culture of moral modernity lacks the resources to proceed farther with its own moral inquiries, so that sterility and frustration are bound to afflict those unable to extricate themselves from those predicaments. What I now understand much better than I did 25 years ago is the nature of the relevant Aristotelian commitments, and this in at least two ways. When I wrote After Virtue, I was already an Aristotelian, but not yet a Thomist, something made plain in my account of Aquinas at the end of chapter 13. I became a Thomist after writing After Virtue, in part because I became convinced that Aquinas was in some respects a better Aristotelian than Aristotle, that not only was he an excellent interpreter of Aristotle's texts, but that he had been able to extend and deepen both Aristotle's metaphysical and his moral inquiries. And this altered my standpoint in at least three ways. In After Virtue, I had tried to present the case for a broadly Aristotelian account of the virtues, without making use of or appeal to what I called Aristotle's metaphysical biology. And I was, of course, right in rejecting most of that biology. But I had now learned from Aquinas that my attempt to provide an account of the human good purely in social terms, in terms of practices, traditions, and the narrative unity of human lives, was bound to be inadequate until I had provided it with a metaphysical grounding. It is only because human beings have an end towards which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do. So I discovered that I had, without realizing it, presupposed the truth of something very close to the account of the concept of good that Aquinas gives in question 5, in the first part of the Summa Theologiae. What I also came to recognize was that my conception of human beings as virtuous or vicious needed not only a metaphysical, but also a biological grounding, although not an especially Aristotelian one. This I provided a good deal later in Dependent Rational Animals, where I argued that the moral significance of the animality of human beings, of rational animals, can only be understood if our kinship to some species of not yet rational animals, including dolphins, is recognized. And in the same book, I was able to give a better account of the content of the virtues by identifying what I called the virtues of acknowledged dependence. In so doing, I drew on Aquinas' discussion of misericordia, a discussion in which Aquinas is more at odds with Aristotle than he himself realized. These developments in my thought were the outcome of reflection on Aquinas' texts and on commentary on those texts by contemporary Thomistic writers. A very different set of developments was due to the stimulus of criticisms of After Virtue by those who were in radical disagreement with it. Let me approach their criticisms by beginning from one that seems to result not from a misunderstanding, but from a careless misreading of the text. Because I understand the tradition of the virtues to have arisen within and to have been first adequately articulated in the Greek, especially the Athenian polis, and because I have stressed the ways in which that tradition flourished in the European Middle Ages, I have been accused of nostalgia and of idealizing the past. But there